Good morning and welcome to the second episode of OT Investigate. In this, fortnight's episode, I guess technically, I'm going to be looking at the question, as a beginner player, should you be going to tournaments and what are you going to gain or what might you lose out on as a result of going to tournaments? In order to define what a beginner player is, I'm going to create a sort of general definition. I think it's someone who's played maybe a couple of games, 2 or 3 games. You've got a reasonable understanding of the rules, but maybe not fully understanding everything involved with the game and all the little details and stuff like that. But you've got a general idea of what's going on. And I'm going to split this into 3 main sections. The sections are going to be why should you go to tournaments, why you shouldn't go to tournaments, and then the final section is going to be what the alternatives are to going to tournaments. You know, how can you play SBG without going to tournaments? So for the first section, looking at, why you should go to tournaments, again, shout out to the subscribers. Onod tried to sabotage me, but thank you for your responses. I gave out 4 main options with, the option to comment below. The first one was you're getting tips and tricks from more experienced players. You can play a lot of MESBG in a short time. You can play against new people, and it's rewarding if you are a competitive person. Now, I really had no idea what the perception of these would be and what the response would be. So it was interesting to see what people said. The overwhelming one was a big motivation is that you get to meet and play against new people. And I can really see the logic behind that, especially if you're a new player to the game. Maybe you don't know many people in the scene and you just want to get out there, meet a few people. Perhaps some of them will be local to you and you can arrange to play games against them in your spare time, which would be really nice. The next reason, which came in at 26%, was the you can play a lot of SBG in a short time. And this is quite an interesting one because I think in a more casual setting, whether it's against your mates or if it's at a club, you're not likely to be under much of a time restriction. So it's likely that a game almost takes as long as the amount of time you have. Whereas in a tournament setting, because you have that timer, you're forced to play more quickly. You're forced to go through, a greater variety of scenarios in a shorter amount of time. And I think it is going to teach you a lot about the game in a relatively short period of time because you're forced to play, as I say, under that time pressure. The third one was the one actually that came to mind when I thought of this first, was you're getting tips and tricks from more experienced players. Now, this isn't just limited, obviously, to the tournament setting. This can exist in other scenarios, but a lot of the stuff I've learned at learned about SBG has come from tournaments and from playing against people who, knew more about the game than me and gave me little tips on positioning and, how to use bows, throwing weapons, stuff like that. So, that's another compelling reason. And the final one, which I thought was probably the weakest and it showed in the poll, was if you're a competitive person, you're going to find it rewarding. But there are some pitfalls to that, which we're going to come on to in just a second. Now, the flip side of the argument, why shouldn't you go to tournaments? And this was sort of something that I've initially was quite against tournaments. As an SBG player, I didn't really see the appeal, but having played a few more of them, I think I've begun to see more why people go to them. But a lot of these were my initial perceptions of why you wouldn't want to go to a tournament, and I listed them out here. So the top one was the tournament environment might be too competitive, might be a bit overwhelming. It may not be actually that helpful to learn the game. We'll come on to that one more in a second. Then I think the most compelling one is the cost of entry, travel and accommodation, which, again, I'll explain more in a second, and a large time commitment. It's often going to take up all of a day or a weekend. Now, the response to the poll for these, I'll go through them in order. So the primary reason, only just, to be fair, it was pretty close, but only just was the cost of entry, travel and accommodation. Now, you can normally expect to pay between £10 to £50, depending on the tournament you're going to, whether it's a 1 day, a 2 day. Obviously, you can pay more for, the big one at Warhammer World or whatever. Those can go up to £100. But for the majority of tournaments, it's going to be between £10 and £50. However, that's not the whole cost because you need to get there. And if it's a weekend thing, you need to arrange some accommodation. And very easily, you can double, triple, whatever the cost of your entry just by getting there and finding somewhere to stay. You can very easily end up spending, if it's a long way away, 100, 150 quid, 200 quid, whatever, on going to a tournament and playing some games of SBG. And that is definitely something to consider if you're just getting into the game, because it's a big financial commitment to make for something, you may not necessarily enjoy that much. The next one that came in second, 31%, was the tournament environment might be too competitive. And I think there were some really interesting points raised in the comments here, which I think was to do with how I phrased the question, which maybe wasn't entirely correct, is that there might be a difference here between a new player's perception of a tournament environment and what the actual tournament environment is. Because there are some tournaments that are really competitive, especially if you're going to those GBHL 100s, those definitely are quite competitive. And it might be a bit overwhelming for a new player. But I think, as was raised in the comments, I think new players often perceive tournaments to be more competitive than they are. Most of the tournaments I've been to, and I've been to sort of 6 or 7 in the last few months, people are going to be really supportive, and actually they are going to help you out. Like, they might not necessarily help you like win, as it were, but they're not going to like punish you super hard for mistakes you've made. And as long as you put your hands up and admit you made a mistake, there shouldn't be any problems at all. So yeah, I think there is a difference there between maybe the perception of the tournament environment and the actual tournament environment. But there are some that might be a bit too competitive for those new players. But I don't think it should be as big a factor as perhaps some players think it will be. The next one is the large time commitment. And as I kind of hinted at in the entry, travel and accommodation stuff, like, it is going to take up a lot of a day, and they are really quite draining if you're playing 3 or 4 games in a day at a high level. Like, one of the beauties and downfalls of SBG is a lot of it's decided in those fine margins, you know, measuring things and like what your intentions are and explaining that to your opponent and stuff like that. And it can end up being quite fatiguing and, you know, a bit bitty trying to explain all that stuff. So it is something to consider, that actually this is going to be quite an intense day if you're taking it seriously. If you're being a bit more casual, it won't be quite as intense, but it is definitely something to consider, that it will be a fatiguing experience. And the final thing is, it may not actually be that helpful to learn the game. And this was, again, the weakest, because I do kind of disagree with this one. I think actually, for the most part, as I hinted in the tournament environment bit, which I talked about, most people will be really willing to help you out, especially if you know, say you're a newer player and you're a bit, unsure about the game. Most people in the community can be really helpful in helping support you through your first tournament experience. So I wouldn't worry too much about that one. And then we come to the alternatives to tournaments. Now, these are not as popular as tournaments, and while they do exist, they are sort of a bit rarer, and they're maybe a bit harder to find. But there are events called game days, and basically these are based around not competitive play, but more around themey play. And it might be that, you know, you get a prearranged list of armies which you might be able to fill. But yeah, they are an alternative, and you won't get the same competitive experience, but you will get sort of perhaps a more thematic and relaxed experience, which might be a really good way to start off your, you know, and especially if you want to meet other people in a less competitive setting, that might be a really good way to start. And then, as hinted at before, I've mentioned it a few times now, you can play at a local club. Unless you're really far out in the sticks, it's very likely there's going to be some kind of local club that will play near you. Now, SBG isn't the widest sort of spread of games. It may be that, you know, they're playing 40k or fantasy or something like that. Maybe there isn't that SBG community, but it's fairly likely that if you do drop a message in one of those groups, that somebody might have an old SBG army they could grab and give you a game every now and again. So definitely worth messaging a local club if you are looking for some gaming experience. So in conclusion, I think there are some compelling reasons to go to tournaments and some things to consider as to why you maybe shouldn't go to tournaments. But as long as you go there with sort of the right expectations, and, you know, you're not looking to maybe win your first time out, but you're just looking for the experience and to meet some new people, I think tournaments can be a really positive experience for you as a newer player. But that's it for today's episode. Thank you for listening. Obviously, again, as I hinted at last time, I really hope you're not just here for this content. There is much better stuff, specifically the back reps produced by Mare over on the Hobby Breakfast podcast channel. But if you're not subscribed, drop us a subscribe, and please remember to like the video, and yeah, see you for the next one.